Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to another webinar hosted by Mandiant Consulting. Today we're going to talk about a topic very common to a lot of the subscribers watching this webinar and other people who are enrolled in responsibilities to take care of information security in their environment, which is enterprise and incident response. Before we jump into the webinar, I'm going to give the remaining registrants maybe just 45 seconds just to jump on. We've got 50 on so far, but we're expecting another 300. So I'm just going to mute the line for 45 seconds. So please bear with me, and I'll be back in the next 45 seconds. Thank you. Okay, so got some more additional registrants there. So thank you everybody for taking the time out today. I know you've all got a busy schedule. So today we're going to cover some of the specifics of how traditional and how incident response is done by Mandiant, a FireEye company. And today, obviously, more so than ever, we're responding to a lot of breaches in places like in Europe and the Middle East, amongst other areas in the world. And it's been very interesting for our team to learn a lot more about how organizations are prepared when these breaches happen and we come in to provide the incident response. So today we just want to talk a little bit about some of the areas that we focus on and some of the areas that the largest amount of lessons learned are found when we come out of these incident response. And I think we'll kind of focus on 6 main areas as we go on, and they'll be listed in the presentation. So obviously, before we jump into those things, we just talk about, as we always do, the evolution of the attacks and attack patterns. Then we'll move on to things like how we can prepare, seeing as these incidents are on the increase. And we'll talk a little bit about what do I mean by these increase, the attacks being on the increase, and what regions are we talking about, and what type of adversaries. We'll talk about city, and then some lessons learned and recommendations. So hopefully this will cover a few areas that might be relevant to you. It really depends on what your role is, if you're an information security specialist, or if you're somebody that is ultimately responsible for a part of a business, and you're very keen to understand how incident response could be done to ensure that you're managing the risk effectively in your organization. So when we talk about the evolution of the attacks and attack patterns, we talk a little bit about, through all the breaches that we're responding to, what are the statistics that we see that change over time. And one of them that we see is really around the time it takes for discovery. So if you think of a standard organization that's targeted by an adversary, that adversary might attack you in April, but you may not actually discover their presence until December. So that period of time, you've been compromised, but it's gone undiscovered and non-responded to. So that's really that period of time of discovery. Now, what's been quite interesting over the last couple of years is that's been dropping down. That might be for a few different reasons. If you think about the type of technologies that are being implemented and deployed nowadays, they're pretty advanced. They're pretty cool. I mean, the types of sandboxing technologies, the types of IPSs and next generation firewalls, etc. They're all quite clever and multifaceted devices that in some shape or form fire off a signature or some sort of indicator that can give people an ability to chase down. There's also a lot more institutes and organizations that are publicly assisting companies in providing notifications, whether it be at ISP levels or government levels, or just public CERT bodies providing these notifications. People are being made aware of it and then they're responding to it. So that's dwell time, that discovery time is coming down. That's good. That's obviously one of our more positive things that we want to see. But as you look at that then specific to EMEA, what we start to notice is that we do have some challenges in EMEA that makes us a little bit different to the kind of more worldwide statistics, right? And that's usually around, number one, an increased amount of time it takes to do the discovery. And when we talk about EMEA, we got to look at, this is a very large geographical area, all Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So when we look at all the breaches that we're dealing with in those specific areas, the numbers, they tend to be a lot harder, they tend to be a lot longer. We do a lot of work in Europe and the Middle East, and we see that the compromises have been, effectively the adversary has been in the institute a lot longer. They've maintained persistence and they haven't been discovered. So that throws off, and then it basically increases that period of time, which has meant that our customers that we've been working with in the region, when they do respond to breaches, it's a lot harder because the adversaries had a lot more time in the environment to develop persistence mechanisms, to do their, obviously, end goal, which might be to steal intellectual data or just effectively reconnaissance, just to understand what an organization is. So it really varies on what the goals and tactics are. So some of the metrics you just look over there on the left, that's kind of average numbers when we look to the breaches that we respond to in EMEA. So we're taking out United States, Asia, everywhere like that. We're looking at, the customers we respond to, so typical kind of average number, 40,000 computers. So obviously there's ones that are much larger than that, and then there's ones that are much smaller. This average number averages out kind of, typically you'd have an average around 40 hosts. I mean, the worst we've probably ever seen is, maybe up and around several hundred computers compromised and persistence maintained. And then you see the compromised accounts, volume, data stolen, etc. So pretty shocking numbers, but unfortunately it is a fact of what we see. What's good though is we also have, as I mentioned, we have bodies that let us become aware of breaches from external. Not just our own internal capabilities as an organization, but we've got national CSIRTs, we've got other government agencies, cyber institutes. And as a result, organizations become aware that they have a problem, maybe a system in their environment is beaconing out to a C2 known server, and it's been detected through some sort of other network device that then allows that organization to be notified. So what we start to see as well is that number is heavily changing. You see 2012 all the way up to 2015. You see this kind of 50-50. We discovered half of it ourselves. The rest of it was discovered outside. We see that that's now really changing when we start to see that there's, in EMEA specifically, is the high predominance percentage of organizations having to figure this out themselves. So as such, relying on these kind of external bodies to be the source of notification or victim notification is not going to be one of those controlling mechanisms that an organization could rely on. Obviously, we record those statistics during an instant response itself. We'll always record how the notification or how the instance itself was originally raised. This gives you a breakdown of what attackers used initially to try and gain access into the environment. So this is a healthy breakdown of the different vectors most commonly exploited in EMEA specifically. So when you look to some interesting parts there in the table, probably Citrix vulnerability is probably one of those ones that might stand out. A lot of people might say it'd be very rare that we'd expect to see any Citrix as kind of that first vector of gaining access. But unfortunately, single-factor authentication mixed with Citrix is unfortunately one of those situations where we have responded to those breaches, and we tracked it back to the Citrix being the primary vector of access being gained. Citrix, like everything else, is really just another way, a presentation of direct access to a system, as if you left a web server or DP protocol on the internet. You're allowing a way of gaining direct access onto the system. Obviously, Citrix has a little bit more controlled environments, but there's also ways of breaking out of Citrix that we've documented and published. So what were they after? What's really quite interesting here is that we haven't kind of linked this with the different APT groups. This would obviously become a very interesting pie chart if we also did a kind of a multi-phased pie chart to say APT, 22, and various other different groups. Is this what they're looking for? Is this what they're looking for? When we look to EMEA and we break down the different breaches that we responded to, the most relevant ones, then you start to see that this was, in effect, what their ultimate goals were. So if you look over to the right, you see the kind of interesting, you see the PCI data, you see the money transfers. This is very much as what we expect, our kind of more monetary motivations, kind of groups that are financially motivated to gain access to data that they can then either sell directly or they can monetize instantly. But then when you look over to kind of on the left, you see kind of infrastructure documents, you see intellectual property, and then obviously Cisco iOS image. This was really where we look at our kind of more espionage-related groups that we track. They're nation-state groups. They have very specific goals that are set out from their teams of people. They're looking for content. Usually it's reconnaissance information within an organization. If you're a telecommunications provider, well, what does a telco have? Well, a telco has a large 3G network, GSM networks. It has masts, cells. So a lot of that information is documented and stored and can be very powerful because an ISP is a conduit into other organizations. So what we've really seen people kind of, stealing is that very targeted and specific information in their organization. If I had to take very specific breaches, you might then even say that we've linked APT groups directly towards their goals, which would be high tech. So, for instance, there might be a specific country that used this group to attack another country to steal high-tech spec information, maybe manufacturing processing of microchips or some other type of high technology, so as to gain a competitive advantage quickly without having to kind of invest heavily in R&D. So we have seen that. We've attributed and we've directly linked groups, their infrastructure, their tools, their techniques, as to if we see that again, then we know that this is the group and that's what their motives are going to be towards wherever your IP is hosted. So that's kind of EMEA. I'm really kind of removing out United States and all these other ones that would obviously have, relatively similar statistics, but different. EMEA has been in place that Mandiant has spent the last, couple of years responding to a lot of big breaches, and ultimately those statistics reflect that type of work. So what we really got to ask ourselves now is, in that respect, how can we compare? What do we have to look at as the lessons learned from these different breaches? Truth be said, I would have to go region by region to really give you a kind of a, what went wrong here and how could you improve? Because the truth is, there are certain parts and there are certain types of customers that have invested very heavily in their information security for a long time, and they're very mature in the way that they approach security, and as such, their preparedness would often be at a very mature state. And we tend to see this, when you look to certain parts of the world, they have been investing for a long time, and then other parts they just really haven't been investing, but they're starting to now, and as such, they're building up those competencies. So, even if we look at regional demographics, we can typically know where those, response capabilities would lack and where they would typically be mature. And the obvious ones might be, large existing developed organizations that have been around for a long time that have, very high levels of asset value that they've deemed that they need to protect. Maybe they've already had some previous hackings in the past and they've invested massively over the last couple of years. Those are the ones that are going to have that preparedness at this point. So these are kind of six areas that you should really kind of walk away and think about, because if I overlay these 6 areas onto any breach that we've been, these are going to be the areas that we're going to probably really point at and say, this is what we need to improve on. If I'm going to grade you out of 5, this is where I need to get you up to that 4.5 out of 5 in these particular areas. So if you look over in the top left, just to kind of give some context as to what are these areas specifically relating to, rather than just, general buzzwords. So governance is really the one point that kind of links to how your management even see any value in information security. And I think we can all agree kind of 5-6 years ago, most organizations, and I know because I was in different companies talking to, people who are supposed to, manage information security, and they had a hard time telling the business the need to invest in it. But now, because of all the media headlines around, this organization got hacked, 10 million records stolen, it's a very different conversation now, and the executives, they make time, they allot time, they even hire chief risk officers, chief information security officers, and that type of roles were not even kind of existing in those 5-6 years ago. So that has changed. And what governance really links to is those people who are running a business and who have to define where the priorities are and investments are, and how they see information security, and then also how they see risk management and how those two play to provide kind of cyber protection resilience for that particular organization. And no CEO wants now to be in the news as kind of that person who has to stand up and apologize to their customers, shareholders, somebody to say, look, I'm sorry, we'll do better next time, et cetera, et cetera. So governance is really about the internal link between the people who are on the ground doing the monitoring all the way up to the executive, right? During a full-blown incident response, if we're able to tell an organization that they're breached, that might travel up a certain amount to, higher levels of management. But if we start saying stuff like, okay, well, you're a Qatari-based company and you're attacked by an Iranian-based company, suddenly there's going to be a lot more people who are quite interested in management about knowing about who did this, who were they, and why, et cetera. So the nature of the information that we obtain during an incident response often allows us to get higher levels of executive sponsorship into dealing with an issue, to the point sometimes where we're dealing directly with the CEO who's mandating, you must deploy this, you must do that, you must fix that, you must remediate that, which is great, but it's a lot of the after the fact and it always, it's because we've given them the type of information that they really didn't think could have happened prior to us. So governance is really where we look at it. Are there clear security policies and guidance that are adhered to, and the people who do the monitoring and responding in a team, that they're allowed to actually invoke and do their job without being said no to by IT or operations or the NOC or the guy who manages that server or whatever it is. So think of it as like your mantra, your charter, being, okay, this is our emergency response team. In the event of a problem, they are allowed to do this, this, and this. And similarly, if you had an earthquake in a country, you're allowed, if you invoked martial law, the military they have undisputed roles. Basically, the civil, the police no longer have any jurisdiction. The military can take control of everything to ensure that they try and make sure that the general population are safe because of that type of situation. And similarly, the CSIRT team are very likely going to want to get a lot of information to get the picture of what's going on, and they can't have obstacles and politics in their way. So governance is actually one of probably the easiest ones to overcome. You really just need someone to say, yes, you're allowed to do this, but yet it's the hardest one to achieve, because it really means you're giving very strong powers to a team of people upon that type of problem actually being executed. So the second point then is response. So this is really, what is your incident response plan? Do you have one? Yes or no? When you look at the processes that the CSIRT, and again, for those that might be reading, CSIRT and saying, okay, what does that stand for? It's just Computer Security Information Response Team. So basically, might be 1, 2, 3, a team of people that are designated and there in an organization to respond to those breaches. Usually, those are the type of people who have extensive experience in understanding forensics and timelines and understanding how a problem would occur. They can speak to management about what the issue is, and ultimately they can coordinate remediation efforts to bring everything back to operations. So the response is, do you have an incident response plan? And in a lot of cases, in EMEA, when we come to our organization, they don't have an incident response plan, or at least they assume an incident response plan is somehow linked to an IT security policy, which might kind of state, these are the things you are allowed to and are not allowed to. An incident response plan is a very comprehensive set of roles and responsibilities for how an incident should be dealt with, and for how different incidents should be categorized and responded to accordingly. So if you have a very maturely developed SOC and CERT team, you're going to have an incident response plan. If you don't, what ends up happening is, if you think of a funnel, all the issues that are raised, let's just call them issues. I lost my laptop, all the way to our environments being DDoSed, to we just found an IP connecting on the firewall outbound to a very dangerous site that's really well known. So all those incidents can be monitored and detected, but if they're not dealt with, if they're not responded to and mitigated accordingly and remediated, they're never being dealt with, and ultimately there's an ineffective response plan to categorizing and prioritizing events. So, and I can tell you that an incident response plan could, as a document alone, to describe all this, it could be several hundred pages long. This is not, again, a 10 points listed on a Word document pasted up on the wall. It involves communication plans and a lot of information, so that if anybody joins the team, they can clearly see the roles and responsibilities of people during incident response. Then you've got communication. So what communications really talk about is how you communicate with internal or external bodies. We've had a lot of breaches where we've sat down with the chief communications officer, the chief public relations person, And when we've had public breaches, now public breaches have to be, we clearly define that. This is when the media become aware of your breach. You've heard of a few famous ones like Investbank, Bangladesh Bank, and a few other ones where somebody brought it to the attention of the media. It's now in the public. To be honest, well over 80 to 90% of our breaches are not publicly known. They're dealt with within the confines of an organization and they're not publicly disclosed. But if they are publicly disclosed, there is you've been external communication requirements to talk to the public, especially if you're an organization that has shareholders or customers. You need to explain to them, what have we done, what has been the impact, and what is our next steps effectively. And we've thankfully we've got some very good guys on our team who know what you should say to really kind of calm the situation down and give people clear guidance. But when we ask customers what do you want to say or what do you think you should say, usually that answer is just not good. It's a lot of bury the head in the sand approach. Don't say anything, just let it all kind of fizzle away. Unfortunately, that's no good because we need to control the conversation. We need to control what the perception is, and if you don't, then the public or the media would, and they'll drive a story. That's just one point. Internal communications are how do we communicate effectively up to the management that we have a problem, B, that we're dealing with it, and C, that we're going to resolve it, and this is this is going to be the impact. And usually as Mandiant, as a response team, we're usually dealing with the people on the ground, and then we have to help those communicate this up to their management as to what has happened, why has it happened. And this is really where I'd say, most of the challenges come, is trying to help those people explain within an organization what has happened, why should we do this. And that's where a lot of hand-holding, a lot of conversations, a lot of dealing with problems come in. And this doesn't even have anything to do with the adversary. This is really just about communication. It's about clearly explaining what the problem is, how we're dealing with it, and moving on. Visibility is when you look at the tools, when you look at the mechanisms that you have in your organization for gaining visibility into systems and devices. And this is everything that you guys think about, whether it's your network visibility, your endpoint visibility, your logging, your SIM, all that stuff, right? It's the visibility, and obviously there's no blueprint that matches every company. Because if you're a hosting provider and you've got just 10 computers, and most of your infrastructure is server hosting systems, well, the way you're going to do that is going to be much different than a large pharmaceutical that has 60,000 computers and, a small internet connection and 1 or 2 data centers. So there's really no turn, bolt, key, cut and paste, simple solution to how visibility should be done effectively in an organization. But when it does boil down to it, we're always looking for endpoint visibility, forensics, and we're always looking for network visibility. And logging obviously is that kind of glue between them as well, where you might have records of network connectivity and endpoint information contained and trapped in a log file, which is obviously is very valuable. So those 3 types of sources are very important. And when we come into organizations and we find out a lot of it's turned off, or they bought that tool but it's not on, and that's when we start to really kind of we hit speed bumps. We really can't go back historically to figure out if the adversary had been doing anything for a while, and then people start to really figure out why was it relevant for me to have to enable logging. Most people thought that it's some sort of compliance standard to deal with some auditor who's irrelevant. Well, in fact, then we have a breach. It becomes the single most important thing that people suffer from that happening. Intelligence then is really kind of the context part. When we say, okay, so we found this binary, we found this network connection. Now what? What does it mean? So intelligence is really where, I suppose, to be honest, you really have to get a mature state to have this. you deal with the basics first, get your, security risk management posture in place and get your systems and tools and visibility. And then you look at kind of this intelligence, which is where you overlay contextual information to give a proper picture to something that you're finding, which might be just an artifact. In a lot of cases, because of what we built up in our back end, somebody could just have a file and we could literally tell them a whole story about that. Because we have this intelligence back end that, allows us to look at certain artifacts and tell where we've seen that before. Is it a tool that's been used in a campaign, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be very powerful if needed. And we often leave an organization trying to explain to them, how should they build up either their own local intelligence repository or, just get another third-party feed in from somewhere to enrich certain sources that they have. But that again is kind of that wouldn't be the first thing we'd be looking at. We really want to look at the basics first, then move on to those kind of harder areas. Metrics is the last point. This is really simply, recording metrics about how the performance of your team actually works, how tools and systems are actually recording whether you are doing things correctly in your SOC and your CSIRT team. So as, for instance, if you've got cases being started, cases being closed, there's metrics there in terms of time, duration, and numbers of cases. And that alone is just one facet of many different areas that we look to in metrics of, what are you recording, how long, etc. So those are kind of 6 key areas that, truthfully, when you come out of an incident response, an organization has lost, they've lost a RAR file that's been copied out of the organization. We find out that the RAR file contains their budget documents and they're a financial institution. And now we had so many questions left unanswered. We didn't know if they had sent that file out ever before. We had no logging enabled, etc. Also, we spent, far too long during the investigation trying to roll out, new controls. So suddenly we're pointing at things like, well, your visibility was really weak and your governance really impacted the response. So we would then be able to say to an organization, these are the key areas you have to work on. If this ever happens again, you can solve such high degrees of this problem by improving the visibility, which again is just turning on that tool, and then the governance, which is again just agreeing with management that your charter is to respond to this without restriction. So again, those things, unfortunately, it's like a lot of things, we don't put them in place until we've been impacted. But that's unfortunately a kind of a after the fact situation. Just a side note, there's a section on your presentation screen here on the right, whereby you can type in questions. So please feel free to type in any questions there, and I'll try and answer them. There's also attachments and links on the right. So as you're looking at your portal, feel free to type any questions that are relevant to this presentation, and I'll try and answer them at a later stage. So we'll talk a little bit about a particular case here. I'm just going to jump over 1 or 2 slides here. So we'll talk a little bit about, a case and something that's relevant. So one of the biggest challenges that we face is we come into an environment based on let's say an incident that's linked to a unauthorized access to a system or a server, and that unauthorized access was done, and then there was a file dropped, and that's the whole basis of the incident, right? So now the real question everybody wants to know is, what did the file do? Where else is it? How do we know that we're now protected? Can we go back to normal operations, right? So I will tell you that that is a series of questions that's going to cost you a lot of time and a bit of heartache and probably a few dollars, because you're going to need to know, is this found anywhere else in my environment? So how will I go check that? You know, will I use an existing tool? How will I go figure it out? Do I have to write a script and go figure it out? That's a lot of time, a lot of effort. And if you're not prepared for it, you didn't have that forensical capability already in place, now you got to go chasing after it. So these are some of the problems that we face. But as we use our methodology is around high investments to start. So we deploy agent technologies, we deploy network sensors. This is a high investment at the initial part of an investigation, but the payoffs are we can finish our investigation sooner, we can bring organizations back to normal operations quicker, and we're not playing whack-a-mole, which is basically we fix one system only to find out there's another one, and we go to that one, and then so we can do things a lot faster, but it's a high investment at start. But what we got to look at is what is the biggest problems when you think about 50 or 60,000 computers, when we started off with a file sitting on a server, and now we got to go figure out where else it is. Well, the immediate things are, there's going to be a lot of noise. Okay, so if you look over to if you look at the screen here, what we're really trying to talk about is how the traditional approach failed us when we kind of went from one system to another system. You know, we got EnCase and we took a full disk and we spent 3 days looking at it, and then we found from that there was movement to 2 more systems, and we take the EnCase from those. You are losing huge amounts of time at that, and you will never keep up with an adversary if you're doing like full disk forensics on a box, simply on that kind of way. And the reason is, you know, again, they're really not always very linear. There's not always a perfect chain between them. In a lot of cases, there's a gap because of logs being erased or system taken offline. Again, if you have a 496-day dwell time, think about it. You've got logs that have rolled over, systems will probably be taken offline during that time. A lot of things happen that will break the breadcrumb trail. So what you got to do is you got to rapidly kind of investigate the whole environment in one go, because you'll have a lot of pivot points, lateral movements. So again, you need to be able to do this all in the one shot without hoping to follow a breadcrumb. Also, another thing is you've got noise from other commodity malware. If you do an incident response in even 2,000-3,000 computers, you could come up against hundreds, if not thousands, of other pieces of commodity malware. And there's no reason to assume during an incident that, because everything is of a heightened sense of priority right now, that if you find another bad file, people get worried, okay, is this linked to the first one? So it's very important that you have people that are obviously very well versed in understanding that this is, yes, this is a virus, but this is commodity. It's not targeted, and it's not part of this campaign. Let's move on. And that ability allows you, your forensic investigators, to actually get past a lot of that commodity and noise. And I can assure you that's probably one of the things you pay the most for from an experienced investigator, because that new hash will chase everything, whereas the old hash will know this is commodity, it's not targeted, so, you know, record it, but move on. So what's key is you've got this large environment, as I said, and what we need to start figuring out is we need to start ruling out systems where there is commodity, and then we need to start tracking quickly where there was lateral movements. So what we start to be able to do then is rule out those systems that are not part of this investigation, and then start leaving ourselves with where the access hosts were by our perpetrator or our adversary, and start linking the dots together. This starts to then leave away the systems and information that's not relevant to the investigation, and starts to leave us with the blueprint of effectively what has been compromised and what may still be compromised, and what's the extent of this damage. As I said to you, this all started off with one server and one file, but now a week later, it's actually, you've got 20 computers and you've got 5 accounts hacked. So again, the scope grows, that you need to be able to do this fast. So all of a sudden we're at this point where we've eliminated and removed this noise. So some of the metrics that we start to see here, as we kind of mentioned earlier on, would be when we look to typical breaches or this particular instance in accounts, we look at 33 systems that have been compromised. We looked at 32 accounts being used. So again, a lot of password credential harvesting, staging systems for exfiltration, and you see earliest time of compromise, which again shows a long periods that the group have been and had access. You see a lot of network indicators. It's very rare that we have an APT group that will use one C2 server. In most cases, they'll have minimum of 3 or 4, and then obviously here we see 26. So they'll have a lot of different effectively hosted servers for, again, kind of command and control aspects, droppers, and all the different staging and exfiltrations that they need. Malwares and utilities, these are going to be, you know, all your kind of things that look like putty, all your things that look like PowerShell, all for moving files around, etc. So the technical aspect of this was, well, number one, which made this a little bit unique, was heavily use of third-party providers. So what I mean by that is you've got like a company that provides a NOC service, or they manage your SIM or something like that. They're trusted to you. So as they're compromised, they provide a perfect conduit for compromising you as the end customer. So you see here, number one, the attacker compromises the third-party service provider, but the email then comes from the third-party service provider. That email is weaponized, and then ultimately the end customer is now got a compromised system. That compromised system calls out to the attacker's infrastructure, downloads the tools, and then the attacker can then start doing the reconnaissance and lateral movement over to the Exchange servers, drop the web shells. This becomes a very common pattern that we see, and the most important part here is the use of the third-party provider, because when you've got all these email gateway, anti-spam filtering solutions, a lot of cases there's these rules to kind of don't treat this company as harshly with your anti-spam rules, because we know them. So don't block this, don't do that, whatever it is. And even if they're using business-to-business encryption, they're a known and trusted provider, so the weaponized attachments come through. So again, here it kind of just gives you an idea of the flow of the conversation, and this was an interesting part because this goes back to, you know, the points that we talk about, the communication and how it all breaks down and how you end up getting, you know, compromised. In a lot of cases, this looks like what happens in most companies, and also this is a kind of a variant of what often happens in companies. So you kind of see things like, you know, weaponized emails being received by a person, not too sure if it's bad or not, sends it on to IT. IT are under pressure to figure out what it is, and then they just use very basic tools to check if it's, you know, is it on VirusTotal? No, it's not. All right. So then they basically run it, test it themselves, and then obviously they can have compromises internally. So really the point that's relevant here is, you know, the pressure on IT and other resources to kind of, you know, do we have a problem? They don't have the skills to basically understand what is it that they've been received. And then they kind of say, no, you know, I don't have enough time to look at this, so I'm just going to say to you, this isn't a problem. So again, the lessons learned are, you know, number one, confirm there's a breach. I mean, the confirmation, a lot of people sit on what they first saw. They sit on it for a week, really kind of just saying, we're not too sure, and this is allowing the perpetrator and adversaries a lot of time to move around. We have to remember as well that if it is targeted, unlike commodity malware, targeted means that there's a human sitting at a keyboard and they will start to make changes if they notice you're onto them and you're responding in a very whack-a-mole way, which means one system at a time. They can just change the techniques quite quick, and then that means that could be as simple as just changing the signature on a file and changing a C2 IP, and then voila, all those remediation efforts that you just did, they just redo the campaign over again. Timing is critical. As I said to you, again, responding to incidents nowadays with kind of forensic end case, box by box, will not deal with the problem fast enough. You won't get a scoping. You got to stay focused on the incident at hand. If you're following an attacker group, so as not to get drifting off and focused about commodity malware, we've got to look at the problem and stay focused on the adversary. And then again, if you have breached, engaging with forensic, legal, and PR experts is very important. And this is before you have breaches, because you're trying to understand what kind of communications would we do if we had a simulated attack. So again, doing red teaming, doing these simulated exercises will expose a lot of weaknesses in your own internal teams and processes. And don't worry about those weaknesses. Just use those as, that's my homework. I got to fix those parts. It's not a bad thing. It's just that's the problems we have, and now I know I need to go deal with them and address them, right? Obviously, ensure strong segmentation controls and backups. After an incident, focus on broader security improvements. Once kicked out, attackers try to come back. So that's the other part, is to don't have a false sense of, we're protected forever. So those are kind of the areas that are, again, obviously recommendations. In this particular account, we implemented multi-factor authentication in jump servers. We monitored usage of privilege counts. We built an IRP, an incident response plan, and we think about security from the perspective of an attacker. So they're the key points. We hope, this is an attack that just happened very recently. We hope that that's informative and somewhat relevant to you as a listener. I very much appreciate your time. I had one question there before we wrap up, which is, what's the best resource or certification to build and assure the enterprise incident management? So in terms of a certification, I would probably look to something like FIRST if you wanted kind of to look at the basics of how you should do incident response. Obviously, my recommendation for someone like yourself would probably start off with looking at what is your incident response plan right now, and if it's quite weak in terms of dealing with these type of adversaries, particularly APT related, I would get a third party to do red teaming, simulated attack of your environment, expose the broader picture and problems that you have, and then develop out an IRP. And you can test those IRPs yourself internally with your team. It's quite cost effective. Anyways, that's the end of our session today. We will close down in the next 10 seconds. So thank you all. I know you all had a very busy day and other things to do, so we appreciate it, and have a good day. Thank you.